Hey, I'm Katie Elise, a life coach to fellow mamas with special and medical needs kids. I teach simple and doable ways to live your life with more intention, shifting away from caregiver burnout and towards the thriving life that you desire. I also share stories from real moms just like you because I believe that sharing and honoring our stories is essential to feeling less alone on this journey. This is the Thriving While Surviving podcast. Let's get started. Hello, how is everyone's January so far? So I have been sick off and on for the last few weeks, so that's been fun. And then we had some pink eye in the house and just all sorts of fun surprises. Anyone with kids knows what I'm talking about this time of year. It just seems, well, especially with little kids, inevitable that the germs are going around. So that's fun. And I was worried I wasn't going to be able to get this episode out in time, but we will see. So you'll just have to pardon me if my voice is a little bit off and if I'm coughing a little bit. But I am here and I am excited to be sharing with you guys today. So today I am going to be sharing about my journey as a medical mom. You might be wondering, what is a medical mom? A medical mom is really just any mom with a child or children that have ongoing medical needs or a medical diagnosis. I thought that since I will be having guests on this podcast to share their stories around motherhood, that it's only appropriate for me to go first and start by sharing my own. I've decided to break my story up into 2 episodes. Today's episode about medical motherhood and next week's episode about my experience being a mom to neurodivergent children. There's a lot of overlap here, but I figured this would be the best way to break it down. Before I share, I want to preface my story with this. For a long time, I didn't share a lot of the struggles that I experienced in my parenting journey for a few reasons. I never wanted it to seem like I view my children as a burden, because I don't. My children's stories are not a tragedy, and I never wanted to paint them as such. I also never want to take their story and their identity on as my own. But what I have come to realize is that the reality is that being a mom to children with medical needs or special needs does come with its own unique set of struggles that most or many parents don't face. My children's stories are inevitably a part of my own story. Admitting to and sharing the struggles along with the joys allows us to embrace the full humanity of our experiences and sometimes help others in similar situations along the way. So, with that said, let's start at the beginning with some context. Back in 2016, my husband, Alan, and I were living in Virginia because he's in the U.S. Navy and was stationed there. We are both from the West Coast, and most of my family's in California. I became pregnant, and in my first trimester, we found out that we were expecting twins, which was a total shock to both of us. When you have a twin pregnancy, they refer to each twin as baby A or baby B. So that's just what I'll be calling my kids on here. Because it was a twin pregnancy, which is a higher risk pregnancy, it's routine to see a high risk pregnancy specialist. And when I did see one, they offered to continue to see me for the remainder of my pregnancy. Initially, we were told that baby A was in utero growth restricted, which means that he was on the smaller side and not growing as much as expected, and that he may have something called short limb syndrome, as well as other possible syndromes. The doctor also noticed a ventricular septal defect in baby B's heart, which is a hole between the chambers of the heart. Oftentimes in pregnancy, this tends to close up on its own, but he had me follow up with a fetal cardiologist just to be safe. I don't have the best memory, but I remember that day, the day that we had that appointment, pretty clearly. We weren't overly concerned because the doctor kind of made it out to be just a, precautionary thing, and we really just saw it as a precautionary appointment. The whole time, the ultrasound tech was making positive sounds or comments, which I assumed meant good news, but later found out that was just in reference to getting really good images. So after getting the images that they needed, they had us sit down with the fetal cardiologist in the next room. And she told us that baby B has a congenital heart condition called tetralogy of Fallot, which is a combination of 4 congenital heart defects. She reassured us that with several open heart surgeries, which he would likely need soon after birth, that he would likely go on to live a full and long life. I remember her saying, "Do you know the professional snowboarder Shaun White? He has TOF, which is short for tetralogy of Fallot." Now, this is a lot to take in, but then came the next doozy. She informed us that the naval hospital that I was planning on giving birth at was not equipped with pediatric cardiothoracic surgeons that could perform the surgeries that he would need. So our job was to do some research and decide which hospital we wanted to give birth at where he could receive the best care. The closest hospital that she would recommend was University of Virginia, which was a good 3 or 4 hours away from where we lived. But another option to consider was that we could apply for something in the Navy called humanitarian reassignment, which basically meant that we could apply to leave Alan's current duty station early and temporarily go wherever we needed to go to care for our child, and Alan would work a temporary position at whatever the closest military base was. So we decided to go ahead and apply to do that so that baby B could receive care at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, as its pediatric cardiothoracic surgery department was rated in the top 5 in the nation. And we also had family that lives about an hour away from there, so we knew we would have support that we were going to need with newborn twins that had medical issues. We knew it was a long shot, though, because in order for this to work, we had to apply and hope that it was approved in time for me to fly across the country no later than 32 weeks, according to doctor's orders, which was about a month away. And anyone that knows the military knows that these sorts of things don't usually happen on a quick timeline, so it was a bit of a long shot. The weekend I reached the 32-week mark was the weekend of my baby shower. My sister had flown out from California to throw it, and we had bought a return ticket for me to fly back with her to California just in case the HUMS application was approved in time. The Friday before that weekend, after she had flown in, we got the call that we were approved. So after a baby shower / Super Bowl party on Sunday, I hopped on a plane with my sister, and I have not been back to Virginia ever since. Alan stayed behind to finish up his work and to pack up our stuff to be moved across the country. And I spent the next 2 weeks working to get our insurance switched over because it was in a different region, setting up appointments with OBGYNs, cardiologists, cardiothoracic surgeon, etc., etc. I went into early labor 2 weeks after the move at 34 weeks into my pregnancy. And Alan was still in Virginia and flew out that day. So he was not there for the birth, but he flew out as fast as he could and was there later that day. I gave birth on a Sunday at Huntington Hospital in Pasadena, California, which was about halfway between where I was staying with my parents and Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I delivered via C-section, which went smoothly. I was able to see baby A for just a moment before both babies were quickly transported to CHLA, and I had to stay and recover from my C-section, which was a lot more intense than I had anticipated it would be. My family was able to visit me and go visit our babies at CHLA, so they weren't alone. Alan hopped on a plane as soon as he could that day to fly out, and when he arrived at the hospital, he was able to see baby B, who was on the cardiothoracic intensive care unit, but was not allowed on the NICU floor because he had a cold and it was just too risky with all the preemie babies. So that was difficult. Both boys were premature and they had a really hard time getting a line into baby A. And it was looking pretty scary for a little while, but they eventually got him stabilized. and he ended up not having any sort of syndromes or medical health issues like they suspected that he might. I was pretty much stuck at the other hospital until they released me on Wednesday, so I didn't get to see my babies at all for the first 3 days. I pumped breast milk as much as I could because it felt like the only way I knew that I could be helping them. That whole time was such a whirlwind, and I think I was really just taking things one thing at a time and in survival mode in a lot of ways. I didn't really have the capacity then to process my emotions around everything. But looking back, I've had a lot of grief around the way their birth went. I am beyond grateful that things turned out the way that they did, but not being able to hold or bond with my babies for so long because of their medical needs felt like such a loss. I think it's a very primal maternal thing. And when you hear and see other people holding their new babies right after they're born, there's definitely some pains of grief and around not having that experience. The day after I was able to hold baby B for the first time, and 4 days after he was born, baby B had his first open heart surgery with an amazing world-renowned pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon, and everything went really smoothly. I had no idea what we were in store for the following days, months, and even years. I had really only mentally prepared for giving birth and the surgery that baby B would need soon after. I wasn't really thinking too much about how long they'd need to stay at the hospital because they were born prematurely and all the complications and things that can stem from having congenital heart defects. Baby A stayed inpatient for 2 months, and baby B stayed inpatient for 4 months. During that time, Alan and I would drive an hour or two, depending on LA traffic, which was most of the time, to the hospital every day, often alternating which one of us spent the night there. After baby A came home from the hospital, it was a bit trickier navigating hospital visits to baby B because not only did Alan eventually have to go back to work, we only had one car that we shared at the time. Also, I was now breastfeeding baby A, which thankfully that part of our journey went rather smoothly, despite some painful bouts of mastitis, and also pumping for baby B. The logistics of having one car, having one partner going to work, and the other caring for a newborn preemie at home, and also being at the hospital with baby B, well, it was a special kind of hell. Mostly because it felt like I could never be at the hospital with baby B as much as I wanted to. So I was there as much as I could be, but I couldn't sleep there with baby A. I couldn't even really be there all the time just because I was juggling both babies and it was so hard. I also felt all this guilt around how much I didn't actually want to be at the hospital, even though my baby B was there. When I was away from the hospital with baby A, it felt like this tiny slice of something close to normal new motherhood. And I felt so guilty that not only could I not be there with baby B 24/7 logistically, but also emotionally. Most of the nurses there were so incredibly wonderful, but there were one or two that made some offhand comments about us not being there more, and that just made it even worse. So I was worried about what everyone thought, and it just was a really shitty negative thought spiral that I wish I had known how to manage better. I wish that I'd had some of the mindset management skills that I have now because I think it would have been really helpful. But it's all just a part of the journey and the process, you know? Around 3 months into baby B's inpatient hospital stay, we were visiting one day and I noticed that he kept only looking in one direction, which I thought was a bit odd and unusual. I thought about brushing it off, but something in my gut told me that I should mention it to the doctor, so I did. She ran some tests and did an ultrasound, and it turns out that he had a stroke. They told us that most likely there was a clot from the PICC line that he had that traveled through the hole in his heart, which was going to be repaired in his second surgery, and it had gone up to his brain. I'm so grateful that I listened to my mama intuition that day. And I think that's the first time I really learned how important it is to trust your gut, especially as a mom. Thankfully, he had no noticeable issues stemming from the stroke. They told us that he would likely have peripheral vision blindness, but because he was so young and brains have such neuroplasticity around that age, he may be fine. And he has not had any vision issues yet, thankfully. Baby B was struggling to eat by mouth, which is really common for babies with heart defects. The occupational therapist at the hospital let us know that it was deemed too much of a risk with how he was doing to have him continue to try to eat by mouth. And the doctors were recommending that he get a feeding tube so that he could be fed that way until his second open heart surgery around the age of 6 months. So far, he'd had an NG feeding tube, which is the tube that runs through your nose. But they were recommending that he have a surgery and put in a G tube, which is through your stomach. So we really knew nothing about feeding tubes at that point. They had us take a parent caregiver feeding tube class where they explain and go over how a feeding tube works. Of course, we weren't thrilled about the idea of another surgery, but we knew that in order for him to gain enough weight and be okay, that this was a necessary step. I really had no idea how much that feeding tube was going to be the bane of my existence for the next year or two. Don't get me wrong, I am incredibly grateful for the medical technology that kept my son alive. But because baby B couldn't handle too much food at once, he had some serious reflux and colic issues. For a long time, he had to be hooked up to his feeding pump pretty much 24/7. The bags of fortified milk had to be changed every few hours around the clock. But more than that, his stoma, the area where his feeding button was on his stomach, was constantly sore, raw, and leaking, which caused him a lot of pain. We tried everything to help it, but it was just a real nuisance. Eventually, after a year or two, he no longer needed his feeding tube and we were able to remove it. The stoma or the hole is supposed to close up on its own, but in his case, it didn't and was causing major pain for him. I had to do so much advocating on his behalf to get any medical practitioners to take us seriously. And eventually, after a couple ER visits from him bleeding and screaming in pain, they finally surgically closed it. When baby B was still inpatient at the hospital and we were preparing for him to come home, a hospital social worker let us know that if we were interested, we would qualify for in-home nursing support for baby B due to his medical needs. I knew that we could use all the help we could get, so we decided to move forward with that, and I'm so glad that we did. We had in-home nursing support for at least a year, maybe two. That time is such a blur that I honestly can't remember for sure. When baby B came home, he had 14 medications that needed to be administered, some every 3 to 4 hours. His feeding bag needed to be changed every few hours. He required breathing treatments with a nebulizer twice a day. We also had to give him Lovenox injections, which is basically a shot in his leg every day leading up to his next surgery. So for a couple months, that was due to the stroke that he had. That was the worst because it caused him so much pain and it left the worst bruise on his legs, worse than usual because the baby aspirin that he took made him bruise more easily than normal. Not to mention the normal baby stuff like changing diapers and whatnot. So while having nurses in our home for much of the day and night wasn't always easy, it was honestly a big part of why I think I was able to survive that period in my life. We had some not so great nurses, but most of the nurses we had were wonderful, and some even became like a part of our family for a season. I will forever be in awe and gratitude for nurses and the work that they do. Because the boys were born prematurely, the NICU nurses let us know that they were at a higher risk for developmental delays and gave us information on the regional center and the free services they provide to help at-risk children under the age of 3 with therapies and services. So pretty much from the time they came home from the hospital, we got plugged into the regional center and started weekly occupational therapy, early intervention therapy, and eventually speech therapy once they were 18 months old. While I had never felt like my career really took off, I also had never intended to be or wanted to be a full-time stay-at-home mom. To be honest, I had been on the fence about having kids for a while and eventually decided that I did want kids. However, my pregnancy was unplanned, and I feel like ever since that surprise, my life has just been full of unexpected surprises. I am incredibly grateful that I had the resources to become a full-time stay-at-home mom because that's what my children needed with their extra needs. However, I think that because I became consumed by a role that I had never viewed as my entire identity, I felt a loss of identity during those early years as a stay-at-home mom. When baby B was almost 2 years old, late one night he was sick with a cold and had a fever. Suddenly, he seemed to lose consciousness, his eyes rolling to one side and his body going limp, with one side very slightly twitching. He was having a seizure, but he had never had a seizure before, and we had no idea what was going on, only that our medically fragile child was clearly not okay. Alan and I panicked, and I called 911. I remember talking to the operator and feeling like I might pass out while on the phone. An ambulance came, and I went with them as they took baby B to the hospital, and Alan stayed home with baby A. I remember feeling more afraid during that drive than I had ever felt before, even during his open heart surgeries. At least with those, I had been prepared by medical professionals for what was happening and what to expect. In this moment, I didn't know if my baby was dying or what was happening to him. At the hospital, they told us that he had had a febrile seizure, which is a seizure that is triggered by a fever and is actually quite common in children. Febrile seizures are something that children typically grow out of around the age of 5 and 6. I am definitely no expert on seizures, but from my understanding, most febrile seizures last a minute or two. Baby B's seizures have always lasted much longer, up to 15 minutes even, which can be really dangerous. After living in my hometown for 2 years after the boys were born, Alan's humanitarian assignment ended, and he was stationed with a carrier ship in San Diego. While we were sad to leave our family and uproot the boys from their therapies, San Diego is where Alan and I met and where we've always wanted to end up. So in a way, it felt like going home. Alan was on sea duty there, which meant that he would go out to sea for underways for weeks at a time and eventually would deploy for 6 to 8 months at a time. His first deployment, well, not his first deployment ever, but his first deployment since we'd had children, left in January 2020. I was not very plugged into community at that point, and I knew from the underways that Alan had already done that if I was going to survive on my own with my then 2-year-old twins, I was going to have to find some community, friendships, and support, and do it fast. My family lived 2 hours away, so while visiting was definitely possible, it wasn't the same as having family support in the same area as us. I found a church that I really enjoyed, which was a bit miraculous considering how much I had deconstructed my faith and religious upbringing by that point. And I joined a local YMCA so I could utilize their childcare, work out, and make sure I had some time for myself. And then the global pandemic happened. All my plans for being in community and having support while Alan was deployed suddenly crumbled. I was isolated in the house most days with just my toddlers. And if you had anyone with medical complexities or a compromised immune system in your life during the pandemic, you probably can relate to how cautious I was. It felt like baby B had been through hell and back, and I sure wasn't going to let COVID be his downfall, which for us meant no playgrounds, which had been one of my saving graces in our neighborhood. During the summer before Alan returned from deployment, baby B had another febrile seizure in the middle of the night. I called the ambulance, once again feeling like I might pass out while on the phone and being terrified that if I did, there would be no other adult around to care for my child or my children. When the ambulance arrived and took baby B, I realized that I had to decide whether to bring baby A and go with him in the ambulance and then be stranded at the hospital, or take baby A and meet the ambulance at the hospital so I wouldn't be stranded, which is what we ended up doing. They took him to a local hospital and had intubated him because apparently he was having trouble breathing. I remember being there and being worried about baby B and also being worried about baby A witnessing all of this happening to his brother. They then transferred us to the local children's hospital. When I arrived there, they wouldn't let me bring baby A up with me to see baby B because of the hospital's COVID policies. So I called my mom at 4 a.m. and asked if she could drive down the 2 hours from where they lived and watch baby A so I could be with baby B. It was a hot mess, but we survived. To add to all the stress, Alan's carrier ship had a COVID outbreak on it near the beginning of the pandemic. Thankfully, he was fine, but it was just a long, dark, and difficult 6 months. Alan came home, and we had about 3 or 4 months before he had to leave for another 6-month deployment. Right before he left for his next deployment in November 2020, everyone deploying had to isolate for 2 weeks at a local hotel to prevent people from bringing COVID onto the carrier. During this window, baby B had another seizure. In order for Alan to leave to come help us, he had to put in a request, which was denied. Because of the length and complexity of baby B's seizures, the doctors at the hospital recommended he start taking an anti-seizure medication. Soon after, the boys and I moved into my parents' house as I decided I did not want to do a second deployment without any support. The anti-seizure medication had major side effects. Baby B, who was typically my more chill child, was having multiple daily meltdowns to the point that his personality was drastically different. We worked with a neurologist at CHLA to wean him off of the medication, as well as he had an MRI of his brain at the same time that he was scheduled to have an MRI for his heart. The neurologist said that it was possible that he had epilepsy due to the complexity of his seizures. However, it was difficult to tell if they were febrile seizures that he would eventually grow out of, or if they were epilepsy seizures that were simply triggered by fevers. Baby B was seizure-free until this past June, when he had multiple short back-to-back seizures that the doctors struggled to stop with medication. He had an inpatient stay at Children's Hospital Orange County because at the time he had the seizure, we were visiting with family in Laguna Beach. I'm pretty sure we've now been to all the major children's hospitals in Southern California. This time, the doctors diagnosed him with epilepsy and put him on a new anti-seizure medication that we hoped would not have negative side effects like the previous one that we had tried. Unfortunately, as we increased his dosage as prescribed by the doctors, baby B had compulsive thoughts about dying all day long that he seemed unable to stop. He never talked of wanting to die or anything like that, but it's still so concerning as a parent to hear your 6-year-old not only be so concerned about dying, but also to have uncontrollable compulsive thoughts. We switched him to a different anti-seizure medication that he is still on today, and thankfully that has had very minimal side effects. Sometimes it's still surreal to me that baby B has epilepsy because it doesn't affect him on a daily basis other than taking his medication. I cannot fathom what it must be like to have your child have seizures that happen on a regular basis and what kind of toll that must take on your life and your child's life. If you don't know baby B and his history, you would have no idea everything that he has been through medically. So much of what he has dealt with and deals with now is invisible to people that don't truly know him, and I think that can have both its benefits and its downsides. That includes both his medical history and his neurodivergence, which is what I will be talking about on my next episode because it was honestly just too much to put all of my parenting journey in one episode. This last year, baby B also had his third open heart surgery, which thankfully went really smoothly. That will hopefully be his last open heart surgery. That was the surgery where I remembered my dream of creating this podcast and creating a place where moms with medically complex children could share their stories and feel less alone in their journeys. Looking back, if I had started my podcast then, my journey as a medical mom was only just beginning. That's the thing about our journeys and our stories. They're never finished until the very end. I know so much more now than I did back then, and someday I'll look back on this current version of myself with even more knowledge and wisdom. I think back to the version of myself that was struggling to get by in a whole new world of parenting babies with medical needs, with so much love and grace for what I was dealing with, even though at the time I was afraid that I was unable to be enough for my children's needs. I think one thing that I've learned from my experiences is to treat the current version of yourself with the same level of love and grace that future you would, knowing that you are doing the very best you can with the resources and knowledge that you have. I have found that the more I'm able to love myself and care for myself the way that we all deserve to be loved and cared for, the better I am able to be there, not only for my children and the people that need me, but also I am able to show up as my whole self, as a person whose motherhood experience is inextricably intertwined into my identity, but not the whole picture of who I am. Being able to make space for that whole person, which is no easy feat, has been so healing for me. Well, that pretty much sums it up. I am so looking forward to sharing more of my story next week with you guys, and I hope you enjoyed that. I will see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it so much if you would consider rating it, leaving a review, and sharing it with a friend that you think might enjoy it. Doing these things will really help the podcast get more visibility so that it can reach and impact more lives. If you found this episode helpful and are interested in learning more about what working with me looks like, I'm currently accepting clients for 2024. I would love to help you make this your best year yet. You can find my contact info in the show notes. See you next week.